Slowly. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Yasmin Kurzi. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a Brazilian woman with light skin and brown hair, wearing a blue sports coat and a black t-shirt underneath. I'm an assistant professor of law at FGV in Rio de Janeiro, FGV Law School in Rio de Janeiro, and at the University of Virginia. I work as a postdoc research fellow at the Digital Technology for Democracy Lab here in the US. So together with my mentor and friend, Jess Rea, who is an assistant professor at the UVA School of Data Science, we are organizing this Gender and Tech talk series to discuss how gender shapes and is shaped by technologies, also drawing on perspectives from the global majority. So we aim to bring together scholars, practitioners, and advocates to explore how our work can contribute to advancing democracy and human rights. Unfortunately, Jess will not be able to join us today, so I will be your moderator for this conversation. Today, we're hosting the fourth session of the talk series, focusing on technocapitalism and environmental justice. The next webinar, titled Data Work and Political Participation, will take place on October 29th at 11 a.m. EST. We'll then have another talk in November on trans-inclusive AI governance to wrap up the series. The exact date for this last talk probably will vary, but we expect it to take place in the last week of the month of November. So consider subscribing to our DTG Lab newsletter. Amy will drop the link here on the chat. So you can, with this newsletter, stay up to date with our upcoming talks and other news from our lab. So additionally, in early 2026, we plan also to release a report on the series that builds upon the lectures and the webinar topics, and also our current research from Jess and I. So for today, we know also that English is not the first language for many of us. So please feel free to ask questions in Portuguese, Spanish, or French. We'll do our best to translate all of them. And you can also use the Q&A feature that is located at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom. So you can pose your questions there. We'll retrieve them after. Automatic closed captions are also available. So I think we've turned them on. Amy, if you could just check that, but I think it's on. So the recording will also be available on YouTube in the next couple of days on our UVA DTD Lab YouTube channel. So today's session, we will explore how technocapitalism intersects with environmental justice, highlighting the destructive logics, social environmental harms, and structural inequalities in digital economy. We examine also how the expansion of the tech sectors contributes to resource depletion, waste and exploitation, disproportionately affecting marginalized communities in the global south, while also interrogating the gender dimensions of these harms. So I'd like first to welcome Paz Peña, who is a 2025 Mozilla Senior Fellow dedicated to studying the social environmental impacts of AI data centers in Latin America. With over 15 years of experience at the intersection of technology, social justice, and feminism, she has collaborated with governments, civil society organizations, and international agencies. Over the past 7 years, her research has focused on the social environmental consequences of digital technologies in Latin America. In 2021, she founded the Latin American Institute of Terraforming, terraforminglatin.net, a pioneer in space for reflection on the relationship between technology and the ecological and climate crisis. So in 2023, Paz also published Tecnologías para un Planeta en Llamas, summarizing her research on these urgent issues. Peña is also based in Santiago, Chile. And Tamara Nisi directs the Climate Justice and Technology Program at the Data and Society Research Institute and previously led the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab, AIM Lab, before joining data and society, sorry. She was lead research at the Green Software Foundation, director of developer engagement on the Green Software team at Intel, and assistant professor of media studies and director of gender and sexuality studies at the University of San Francisco. She's the author of That Glitch, How Technosolutionism Fails Us in This Life and Beyond, and co-author of Notes Towards a Digital Workers Inquiry. Her research has appeared in journals such as Social Text, Social Media Plus, and Society, and the International Journal of Communication. So, yeah, thank you so much, Paz and Tamara, for being here with us. Paz, feel free to start when you're ready. Thank you once again.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, but there's a background sound for I don't know, a vehicle or something, but I hope that is gonna end soon. My name is Paz. My pronouns are she and her. I have black hair, light skin, and I'm wearing a brown sweater, and I have yellow glasses. Thank you very much for inviting me, Jasmine. And yes, it's an honor for me to share this space also with Tamara, which I read and I followed the work she's doing in the last years, right? So I want to have, to have this space with a presentation because otherwise for me it's really difficult to speak, especially in English, without, to actually do the points that I want to say today, right? So give me just a couple of seconds to actually share. I wanted to do that presentation because I want to actually address some issues that are happening around environmental justice and digital justice in Latin America, right? And I really want to use this space for doing that in really few minutes. And to start doing that, I want to start by saying something that it's important, but it's not so common in studies on the environmental impacts of technologies yet, right? And it's has to do with how they affect people, communities, and ways of life. And I want to quote researcher Paula Ricaurte, who says that the study of the socio-environmental impacts of digital technologies must address the network of historical, political, geopolitical, economic, and sociocultural relationships traversed by power asymmetries that produce differentiated effects for the people who inhabit the territory and who are affected by the construction and operation of these infrastructures in the short, medium, and long term. From Latin America, there is a growing, documentation on how these impacts are differentiated across the various intersectionalities of the territories. We see gender, social class, race, and age as relevant factors. However, we also witness how these communities lead resistance movements and, even more importantly, point to other ways of life that often incorporate alternative forms of technologies. Much of this reflection stems from our research with a feminist coalition of Latin American activists called Floresta Digital on the socio-environmental impacts of the global production chain of digital technologies in Latin America. You can see some of the results in Spanish very soon, I hope, next week in English and Portuguese at the platform tramas.digital. Tramas.digital. Later, I can drop the link on the chat. However, this time I don't want to focus on the differentiated socio-environmental impacts of technologies on communities. Instead, I want to reflect on the causes of these differentiated impacts. The feminist framework of studying and acting on unequal power relations is fundamental for us to reflect together on how these power relations today present unusual characteristics and affect on how communities act regarding socio-environmental conflicts over technologies. So in these few minutes, I would like to highlight three key points, right? For reflection on the causes of the differentiated socio-environmental impacts on communities and the challenges this presents, based basically on my observations and experience in Latin America, the continent where I live and actually work. So, the first thing always is where we are speaking from geopolitically. This perspective is crucial for comprehending technocapitalism global expansion. Second, we need to identify the actors behind technocapitalism when discussing its socio-environmental impacts. And these 2 points also help us to understand a third point, which is the power imbalances we are witnessing today and which influence the new challenges regarding the socio-environmental impacts of technologies. So, to start on the first point, the role of technocapitalism at the geopolitical level has become much, much more obvious in 2025, right? As seen in the Trump's meeting with big tech. It's not that it didn't happen before, right? But in a way, the stateful display of Trump's power, which is very jarring in a way, has helped media to capture, actually, in photograph, the alliance between political power and the 21st century capitalism, represented in this case by American big tech. It's what many people call the collusion between the states and technocapitalism. So, to understand the differentiated socio-environmental impacts, it is key to comprehend this geopolitical alliance, as it determines not only the political and economic relations of the world, but also gives technocapitalism an unusual display of power. uh, you have an academic background. You probably know this much better than I do. No, there are several authors, and I know this is a selection of very wide authors. I know I will fix that. Who, regardless of whether one agrees with them or not, each demonstrates in their own way how the concentrated power of these players has caused capitalism to mutate, right? But now in 2025, with this blatant and brazen geopolitical influence that technocapitalism now have, things seems even more worrying to me. Mainly because there is one aspect that tends to be little discussed, which is the growing alliance between digital technology and the reduction of carbon emissions. This is a geopolitical alliance that once again concentrates the power of capitalism in the 21st century. So the actors who are capable of producing what are called frontier technologies are those who are considered capable of helping the world produce less CO2 emissions. So beyond verifying this claim, which somewhat dubious, no? Given the evidence that AI, for example, is not contributed at all to lower emissions. I would like to focus more on the geopolitical framework of this idea, no? So, for example, the European Union openly discusses the geopolitical concept of twin transition, which posits that there can be no energy transition without a digital transition. The real interpretation for, at least here, no, in Latin America, for developing countries is that, right, no, developing countries have to buy technology from the European Union, as they are the good actors, as neither the United States or nor China is particularly interested in going green. No, but this is the framework that they, give to actually to have some sort of a commercial idea, right? However, a more interesting document from the UNCTAD dated 2023 examines what they call frontier technologies and outlines the challenges they pose for developing economies. The report also discusses the actors leading this convergence of frontier technologies towards a zero emission world. And I find this super interesting. These frontier technologies encompass renewable energies, biotechnologies, and of course, digital technologies, including those of the so-called 4.0 era. So please take a look at who the most important providers of these technologies are. Do they sound familiar? Do the same corporations appear repeatedly? Which countries are they from? How many are there? Like really, it's a handle of corporations. And apart from China and the United States, for example, is any country from Latin America present there? So to me, this appears to be an extraordinary concentration of geopolitical power in a few private actors who currently hold significant influence in their respective states. So the question is, looking at these actors, what challenges do they pose for communities that today suffer the differentiate impacts of digital technologies, not as differentiate socio-environmental impacts? This is actually precisely my second point. We must unravel who the actors behind technocapitalism are when discussing socio-environmental impacts of technologies. Because, of course, we have these dominant actors who are few in numbers but exist thanks to an ecosystem that we rarely discuss and that holds considerable power. Let's examine, for example, the ecosystem with data centers and their socio-environmental impacts, which is what I am currently actually studying as a senior fellow at the Mozilla Foundation. So, in the case of Latin America, there are a lot of actors in this data center ecosystem, no? Many of them are organized as interest groups. So, for example, data centers associations and real estate brokers in Brazil, Chile, and Mexico, for example, have growing influence, especially in shaping public discourse. Everything about data centers is beneficial to them and society, and social environmental problems are merely some sort of misinformation, right? Let's also consider governments as another critical actor in increasing the dominance of these corporations, and how, in the case of Latin America, we are witnessing a worrying revolving door, right, between the executive branch and technology corporations. Um, the figures that you're seeing at your screen are from Agência Pública, a Brazilian media that recently, a couple of weeks ago, released these numbers, these figures around lobby actions from big tech in Latin America and comparing to other countries, etc. It's really, really interesting. Please go and see it because it gives a lot of background information, geopolitical information, etc. No? And once again, the collusion between the state and technocapitalism is becoming increasingly clear, as you can see here. Uh, Sometimes it's in a more strident manner, and sometimes in a more subdued one. The above points provide the context for the third point of my reflection is the power imbalances in the 21st century. Technocapitalism force us to consider new nuances in the discussion of socio-environmental justice. This is the work I'm currently engaged in and which I propose you also unravel. From what I have observed in Latin America and due to the time constraints today, I will focus on two things. First, the convergence of renewable energy production for the needs of technological actors, and the concentration of socio-environmental conflicts that it generates, right? So today, we are clearly aware that the enormous appetite for energy is driven above all by artificial intelligence, right? Therefore, technology companies are desperately seeking new energy sources. And energy suppliers are willing to do anything from building new fuel sources to constructing nuclear reactors to striving to provide them with cheap renewable energy. The later point is particularly evident in several Latin American countries, notably the top two in renewable energy generation in Latin America, Brazil and Chile. So, to avoid investing in transmission and distribution lines, green energy companies are also building data centers to host their best customers, tech companies. So the most recent example occurred a few weeks ago in Ceará, in northeastern Brazil, where a TikTok data center will be installed on the same indigenous lands where wind energy is produced. So this convergence is clearly a political, economic, social justice, and environmental issue. First, because it intersects with climate justice. So, climate justice movements highlight that the high environmental, economic, cultural, and political cost of renewable energy generations are being paid by communities worldwide that have not contributed to the climate and ecological crisis, right? So this is the case in Ceará, where the Ananse indigenous community is already paying for the energy transition of their lands with the extinction of their way of life. But now, with the TikTok data centers, now they have to bear the social, environmental, and health cost of data centers in their shoulders too. In Chile, for example, we know that the National Data Center Plan, by the way, headed by a minister who was an Amazon lobbyist in Chile, wants to decompress the growth of data centers in the capital, Santiago, because they encounter a lot of resistance there, and move them to areas with renewable energy where costs for big tech can also be saved. So, in a highly opaque process, civil society and academia know very little more about how these data centers will move to other parts of Chile where renewable energy is produced. But the Brazilian experience of the Ceará region give us some insight, right? Some future lights. So now, as we have seen in the geopolitical context and the actors involved in emissions-free technocapitalism, climate justice intersects with digital justice. The experience in Ceará, Brazil, is the reason for UNCTAD's statement in the 2024 report on the environmental impact of the digital economy, right? And I'm quoting UNCTAD report. They say, developing countries bear the brunt of the environmental costs of digitization while reaping fewer benefits. The second point, and I'm finished my presentation, the second aspect of this power imbalance is the era of technocapitalism is how it affects territorial resistance, which, as I mentioned it early, is almost always carried out by indigenous communities, women, Afro-descendant communities, and lower middle class communities in Latin America. In my opinion, the sustainability of this resistance is in danger. Not only is being a defender of human rights and land rights life-threatening in Latin America, but also because the domestic collusion between state power and private power is now compounded by the geopolitical pressure of technocapitalism intertwined with the world's major state powers. My impression is that in this century, Latin America will see a convergence of social conflicts between the so-called digital and energy transitions. This issue is exacerbated by conflicting interests among the actors involved in both transitions, alongside a growing concentration of power at the geopolitical level. Added to all this is the growing, if not total, capture of Latin American states by technocapitalism. So I believe that the statement made by the Chilean activist Tania Rodriguez, who last year was recognized by Time magazine as one of the world leaders in the discussion of artificial intelligence for her activism in protecting water against a Google data center in Chile, are eloquent in conveying her impressions of the Chilean government's work facilitating data centers investments. And I'm quoting her. It was absolutely disappointing and painful to learn that the government is working for the business community. So I leave two questions for joint reflection in this space. How do these new crosses of power affect communities impacted by the socio-environmental consequences of digital technologies and renewable energies? And what kind of community resistance and activism is possible under these new reinforced power imbalances? Thank you very much, and I leave the floor to Tamara.
Thank you so much, Paz, for your presentation. I think what stayed with me was this idea, like we need to be asking the government, uh, who is actually benefited again by this narrative of progress and development, what it actually serves, who it actually serves. And I think now we are turning to Tamara that will also develop this point. Thank you so much, Tamara and Paz, for being here with us. Tamara, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much, Paz, for that presentation. That was really wonderful. So I will not be sharing slides today, and I wanted the opportunity to be able to riff a little bit because I just got back from Climate Week in New York, along with the UN General Assembly. And so there were some things that were happening there that I thought we should probably talk about. And so, as just a short description, I am a light-skinned woman with long light brown hair, and I'm wearing a pink and red striped dress, and I am based in Oakland, California. So today I'm going to focus a little bit on the historical relationship between environmental justice, gender, and technological development. And so my opening question is, how can we build transnational cross-collar lines of solidarity across the tech supply chain, particularly in this moment of data center accelerationism and AI speculation? And I think that if you have not read her work yet, Ana Valdivia's work on the global AI supply chain and life cycle is incredibly helpful here. It can also be helpful to look at how industries and power relations have shifted over time in different places around the world. And so AI data centers are obviously now a real focal point, as we just heard from Paz's presentation, but the environmental and social impacts of computing, of technology, and resistance to those impacts is not new. So what can we learn when we look at histories of development, pollution, and resistance in a particular place? And that was the impetus for me putting together this blog series for Data and Society, which I'll share in the chat, called The Cloud is Dead, where scholars who are focused on different parts of the world and different periods of history are tracing those long-term relationships between tech infrastructure and development and ideology, as well as different forms of resistance on the ground, especially by women. And so so the other thing about my research is that in my current position as the director of the Climate Technology and Justice Program at Data and Society, I'm spending a lot of time looking at how tech companies are presenting their conception of sustainability or even sometimes environmental justice, and really looking at the power relations within those companies, looking at both the corporate sanctioned forms of sustainability work and workplace organizing. So looking at movements like Amazon Employees for Climate Justice, as well as No Tech for Apartheid. So how are tech employees trying to push back against colonialism, against militarism, and against climate catastrophe. And so I was just in Climate Week in New York, where I heard a number of different tech representatives talking about how AI would help companies reach their net zero goals, even as AI is very obviously contributing to greenhouse gas emissions through the expansion of data centers and the reliance on fossil fuels, as Paz noted, as well as the use of AI products in applications for drilling of oil and gas. Companies are rarely calculating their enabled emissions and the applications that their AI products are used for in their carbon accounting practices. Companies and governments alike are investing in data centers and AI in this kind of speculative frenzy, which is currently propping up the entire US stock market. But it is unclear if the use cases for AI are actually in alignment with this degree of growth, and who will be harmed if these infrastructures ultimately fail. I'm interested right now in how the current investments in AI and the political realignments within tech companies, which are increasingly very explicitly aligning themselves with technofascism, how this turn away from climate and sustainability, even in the kind of greenwashing way that was more acceptable even just a few years ago, and the shift away from diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, within corporate environments, which I think we can acknowledge is imperfect at best. But I'm still interested in the ways that these more sanctioned forms of political engagement for tech employees have also been falling away. And so thinking about the different forms of gendered and racialized labor for the tech critics who are within companies, which are tied to cultures and histories of volunteerism within DEI movements. And so the individuals who are working on responsible AI, ethics, and sustainability within tech companies are now very much at risk if they speak out, if they become whistleblowers, and they're often from marginalized identities themselves. Furthermore, their work within companies may be deprioritized, and it may be difficult for such workers to account for their own productivity and impact via established performance metrics. And often the work of sustainability or diversity, equity, inclusion within companies is done somewhat informally by members of employee groups that are dedicated to specific identities or social causes. And at times, people do become whistleblowers, shifting from a kind of internal metrics keeping to broader political actions. And so there's this interesting tension when it comes to climate action within the tech industry, and that it's shaped by both histories of compliance and activism. This work is also often gendered, and an overwhelming number of the people that I've interviewed from all across the tech industry and in many different parts of the world are women. And many interviewees note that this kind of work within companies is seen as a kind of women's work or non-technical work within companies. And corporate social responsibility originated in the mid-20th century, basically in the 1970s and 1980s, as more corporations started reporting on their social and environmental impacts. And the UN was a big part of this as well. So the UN published a report called Who Cares Wins, and developed a related set of principles in 2006, which were the UN principles for responsible investment. And maybe this is something that you all have seen in different various annual reports put out by companies where they're like, these are our ESG, environmental, social governance metrics. and essentially is a place for companies to talk about all the, in theory, good work that they're doing out in the world. And because Peter Thiel, in particular, really had started railing against ESG as an evil, apparently Chinese communist-backed plan, ESG itself has become a very risky thing for companies to talk about overtly, even as it is still required by a lot of reporting mechanisms from the EU. So you have a real tension right now between this hyper politicization of any kind of DEI, social justice, or social impact and sustainability work within tech, and also at the same time we have this like severe backlash. There is more of a urge, for particular kinds of reporting through the EU CSRD. And so ESG is also a point of interest for shareholders and investors. And so it is the sort of, very typical kind of corporate position. It's a job title within companies with strategists who are focused on environmental and human rights impact assessments and reporting. But obviously, a lot of these kinds of are very, very, focused on metrics and on particular kinds of greenwashing and reporting that will make companies look good, and tend to be very disengaged from the different forms of pollution and the realities of what tech development is doing to communities on the ground. And so just to talk a little bit about what the other side of this. So, we have people within tech companies who are trying to do their work and increasingly finding that difficult. But we also have the communities who are now increasingly at risk from tech development that is happening at an accelerated pace. And so what can also be helpful is looking at some of the histories of tech development and resistance to it. So if we're looking at some of the contemporary tech worker movements around climate action, like Amazon Employees for Climate Justice, or the larger movement of No Tech for Apartheid, there's also a connection to different Silicon Valley-based transnational coalitions that have formed around environmental and racial justice, immigrants' rights, and the labor movement. And I think part of the problem, too, is that when we think about tech worker or Silicon Valley, which, of course, is in many ways an imaginary place, they can be terms that obscure the gendered and racialized labor that actually made tech development happening. And we have all of these images of, geeky male coders, but this tends to be very disengaged from the actual work along the supply chain, whether that be, the mining of raw materials, or the other forms of risky and embodied labor that go into electronics manufacturing. And I think this is another case where, for years it was kind of popular for people to talk about the problem of hidden labor. And of course, for many people in the global South, in the majority world, these forms of labor were never hidden. And that's also true even with us, where, it was actually Indigenous women and immigrant women, even within California, who were performing this dangerous kind of work. So looking at the kind of history of electronics manufacturing, Lisa Nakamura looked at Fairchild Semiconductor's manufacturing plant, which was staffed by Navajo women in the 1960s and 1970s, which is really left out of their official corporate histories. And many other scholars around that time also looked at stereotypes of women of color and their dexterity handiwork as weaving, basically translated into their roles in electronics manufacturing. The sociologist Karen Hosfeld looked at Silicon Valley workers in the 1980s, especially women from Latin America and Asia, who were a substantial portion of the workers in the manufacturing sector of tech. And she notes how employers stereotype such workers in gendered and racialized ways. And she also learned that many of them were hesitant to join official union campaigns and that their mostly male managers would subject them to various forms of harassment and stereotypes associated with their ethnic backgrounds, which women would then turn back against their managers as a form of resistance. And so there were also opportunities that created conditions for coalition building, particularly because of this a relationship between the toxicity of electronics manufacturing as a kind of occupational health matter and the polluting work that the semiconductor industry does when it comes to the land and water in the place where manufacturing happens. Fairchild Semiconductor ended up contaminating the drinking water of South San Jose with a chemical that they used to remove grease from microchips. And this led to a lot of community organizing and the formation of the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition in the 1980s. And what's interesting is that these histories don't disappear, right? So California is still a site of many Superfund sites. And Justine Kama at The Verge recently reported on some of the women who were originally working in electronics manufacturing in San Jose. And she noted that a lot of the women suffered miscarriages, got cancer, and gave birth to children with disabilities. And they're still living with the reverberations of this today. And in one anecdote from the reporting that she put out just a few months ago, a woman is horrified to learn that a church with a program for toddlers now sits on the Superfund site where she had once worked in a factory, which led to her child having severe developmental disabilities. Meanwhile, Xiaowei Wang and Ann Chen look at how electronics manufacturing workers in Taiwan and Korea, which became the new sites of electronics manufacturing in the 1990s and 2000s, after the jobs in California were outsourced and moved away from the US, organized as their colleagues got cancer and other illnesses and died, connecting wastewater pollution, again, to occupational health. And so we have all of these movements today, like CHIPS Communities United, which, much like the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, can unite labor groups and environmental justice organizations. And so something that I've seen a lot in my conversations with communities on the ground who are grappling with the realities of what data centers actually do is that there's a disconnect between the kinds of quantitative metrics that tech companies rely on in order to, say, measure the carbon emissions attached to their model, or thinking about even things like water use and energy use, and the anecdotal embodied experiences of living near a data center. And the problem is that often community gathered data, particularly around environmental justice concerns, is not always legally actionable. And it can be difficult to collect data about health and life quality issues that are not quantifiable. And so technologists might be able to track things like air quality or methane leaks, and environmental lawyers can track things like permitting and siting for data centers and related energy infrastructures. But talking to residents might help you learn about actual health and economic impacts, ranging from the rank smells that displace people from their homes and their farms, to the pollution-related deaths of livestock and even miscarriages. And while some practitioners have started devising frameworks for quantifying the public health impacts of data centers, many of these are still fairly preliminary, and they differ from place to place. And so speculations about the potential health impacts related to backup diesel generators used for propelling data centers and other factors don't really necessarily capture the human stories behind the data. And just to name a few of the other impacts of data centers, right? They increase people's electricity and water bills. They draw community water use away. They take up farmland and other land that might be otherwise used for housing or for businesses. They have transmission lines that cut through public parks and farmland. And there's also noise pollution from the cooling systems and the generators that can lead to things like migraines. And the air pollution from particulate matter is an especially acute concern, particularly for communities that have already been bearing the brunt of environmental racism. And so what's been really interesting is to think about how this has really become a global conversation. And I think one problem that has been coming up a lot in my conversations with community organizers and with advocates on the ground in the US is that as the US, which has become very overly saturated with data centers, right? We have the largest concentration in the world, and certain places in the US, like Virginia, are, the data center capital. But what does it mean if we start seeing more localized resistance to data centers on the ground in places in the US, and how much will that displace a lot of these burdens to Latin America and to the majority world? And so it's been very clear from a lot of the conversations I had, including at Climate Week, that there's a need for, global conversation and coordination, and that it's incredibly helpful to link a lot of the local resistance movements that are bubbling up to these longer histories and movements in other locations and in other industries. So looking at the mining industry and industries that are not directly connected to what we call AI, and that there's a need for better data collection and sharing methods, ensuring that there are legally actionable and policy-related responses that can somehow take these personal experiences into account, which is, a very feminist practice, right? Like the kind of couching individual experience or collective experience as a form of evidence. And how do you measure something like a miscarriage? And so we need community gathered data that can be viable in a legal sense, and spaces with which we can compare experiences across both geographies and temporalities. And I will end there.
Thank you so much, Tamara. We have some questions here in the chat, but I will use my moderator powers to pose on one by my own first, if possible, if it's okay for you. So I think we are seeing this collision between the capitalist actors, as Paz said, and the state in many countries to push these private interests and the corporation interests in developing and deploying and make us dependent of these technologies. And Tamara also mentioned how activist work actually can be a path of resistance of against this deployment and development. Thinking also about the feminist perspective of the feminist frameworks regarding resistance and data collection to provide this data on these abuses, but also thinking of how women and other gender minorities and BIPOC people are also more persecuted and targets of repression by states that are under autocracies or becoming autocracies like the US. I was thinking basically if you could talk a bit more, both of you, on what lessons we could learn from the feminist movement, from environmental justice movements as well, to stop this corporations, and how can we basically protect also those whistleblowers? If you have any advices also for movements that are working on the ground with these issues, if you could talk a bit more about that, it would be really enlightening for me as well. Thank you so much. Paz, do you want to start?
I can start. I'm a slower thinker, so probably I will end up at the end of the meeting with a better response. But first, I would like to say that hearing Tamara's presentation, so interested. We are also facing this backlash on diversity, this backlash on accountability. And I think we are also facing this backlash on regulation, right? So everything has to be deregulated. And we are seeing that increasingly in many countries and as well as in Latin America, because regulation of technology or regulation of anything is impeding investments, right? This is the framework that they doing, right? So that's why in the case of Brazil, in the case of Chile, in the case of Mexico, they are, governments are trying to make these economic plans to attract investments. And that's why you have all these ideas of, try to avoid taxes and, give them cheap energy, cheap water, etc. Right? So it's again, no, what Tamara is saying is that something that is happening in the US, and even if we address the things that are happening in the US, that can end up displacing the problem to other parts of the world, which is a classic capitalism trick, right? You go to the place where there's less regulation, less public opinion, looking at the problem, etc., right? So, in that regard, I do believe, again, that the feminist principles are so important first uh, to examine and, in a way, to denounce the power relationships and the power new concentrations in few actors. I think that is so, so important. And that's why, for me, it's so I feel comfortable using that framework in the analysis of socio-environmental impacts of technologies because it gives you always the obligation to look at the power relationships, right? And the problem that we're facing today, but this is a problem that we're facing since neoliberalism is happening, is this global sides of the problem, right? Again, no, how important it is solidarity in terms of movements to actually understand what is happening and what are the ways to act. But this is solidarity is one thing. Other thing is actually to have the power to stop this kind of movements. But I do believe that um, access to information is something that we lack of and it's so, so important. When we have that information and when we can actually discuss that information in a global scenario, I think things can change. And this is have changed for the feminist movement, actually, right? But also other lessons learned from the feminist movement that can be actually being discussed here is the backlash that you have when you actually have a global movement that works. No, feminism worked a lot, and that's why we are in a conservative, wave through the world because, in a way, they are responding to these changes of life. No, and that's I mean, it's awful, but also it's a proof that things can change in the world. No, with feminism is actually proving that, and I think we have to be very aware of that, very aware of if we actually do a global movement, which I think we are doing it. No, because we're discussing increasingly the socio-environmental impacts. We are seeing the connections with other socio-environmental movements, etc. Right? We are doing that, but we have to be aware of the backlash of that. And I think it's something that we need to discuss, especially, because for communities that are in danger that could be life-threatening, right? This is not a game. This is life-threatening. So it's something that we need to discuss, especially because, as I said before, I'm really worried about this convergence of power between big tech and renewable energies, which are the two of the most important engines of the 21st capitalism. So if the movements are actually addressing those power convergences, the problem is bigger, right? Because the power that you are addressing is bigger. So we also need to actually have to have that in mind when we discuss this. But I do believe, I really, really, really do believe that having information, access to information, the humans' stories behind data has, as Tamara said before, which I think is brilliant, because numbers corporates give numbers, a lot of numbers. Governments give a lot of numbers. No, you don't even know if they are true or not. But what we do have, and what we do know what is true is the stories, the human stories behind data. And I think if we have that and we can actually access to that information and discuss it globally in terms of a transnational solidarity movement, I think it's something that will be give us better position in terms of political action in the present and in the future.
Thank you so much, Paz. Tamara, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Sorry. I just replying to some of the questions in the chat before I forget to do that. So I definitely agree that we are in this very strange moment where we are having a backlash because of particular kinds of success. And it is really surreal to think about how a lot of mega corporations in the US responded after the 2020 uprisings, after the murder of George Floyd, and how they reacted to the end of abortion rights in the US through the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And you have Mark Zuckerberg saying that he's going to pay for his employees to travel across state lines for abortions, which obviously would be an HR nightmare. And the idea that you would ever want to tell your employer that you need to have an illegal abortion. This is not something that would fly within any HR culture. But I think just the idea that companies were attempting to portray themselves as progressive and that this was something that was seen as a kind of corporate value. And there was a sense that you had to do that in order to, make the board happy, to keep investors happy, shareholders happy, and to keep your employees happy. It was a very different time. We have seen now that I think the specter of AI, this idea that AI is going to replace us all. And if you look at some of the incredibly frightening ideologies that are coming out of San Francisco, Silicon Valley, with Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel and the venture capitalists who really do believe that they are going to create a future in which we are all serfs of a kind, and that AI will basically ruin employment for everyone. And so the idea that, you have to appeal to your tech workforce and make people happy and give them, bonuses and perks in order to keep your employees happy is really not what is happening now at all. And in fact, we see companies increasingly think that they can replace even coders, the people who used to be the most privileged class within tech. And so my only hope is that this does create more space for solidarity, in that, as people recognize that even if you think you have a position of privilege because you make, a pretty good salary and have good benefits as a full-time employee within a tech company, you are incredibly disposable too. And I think it's also interesting because as data center expansion grows, even in the US, and so people who are more privileged are also realizing, hey, wait a minute, my electricity bills are going up, and you have people from all different political corners who are very angry about this. And so even in very deeply conservative red parts of the country, like Indiana, we see pockets of resistance to this. And of course, also from the South, where, historically Black people have been the ones resisting technological development and all of the horrible health impacts that, the gas industry, the oil industry has had traditionally on them. And so I think that we're in this very strange moment where all of the power has been even more concentrated into a handful of people and a handful of companies. And I think there's a growing recognition that they are really just hoarding the Earth's resources, and that, if you're not one of the handful of billionaires, you're not going to be in on that. And so that is the one hope I have, that it's gotten so bad that even people who thought that, their kind of progressive liberal values and slim degree of wealth would save them will find that that is not true.
maybe we need campaigns to generate awareness and place awareness in everyone. Thank you so much, Tamara and Paz. We have some questions here in the chat. I'll first get Andre Fernandez, take Andre Fernandez question. André is from the Law and Technology Research Institute of Recife, PREC, IPREC. They are working on an emerging front at the intersection of digital rights and social environmental justice here in Brazil. Also are in a very difficult situation where what was pointed out by the panelists apply in Brazil as well, the opaque influence of lobbies, a government open to companies but not to civil society, the private sector's lack of transparency regarding the environmental costs of AI, and so many other issues. So IPREC is now currently facing the opening of a national data center policy, focusing exclusively on tax exemptions and attracting investments without any dialogue about territorial and environmental impacts. So Andrea would like to know what the strategies also Paz and Tamara would suggest to counter this lobbying of big tech in Brazil as well, and also how we can join forces for a network action at the Latin American global level, putting IPREC's work at the service for this effort as well. So do you have any comments on Andres' question? Paz, do you want to start? Okay.
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting because I think with the case of Brazil and Chile, we're facing the same challenge in a way that we are having a progressive government, even though technocapitalism is still there, no? And even if there's some critics approaches, this is still the same playbook, right? So they please come here, invest in our countries, etc., etc. No, all the national plans are actually trying to capture that investment from big tech, right? I think this year has been a very turning point around lobbying of tech companies in Latin America because before of this year we had the idea that this is important, but we didn't have the information. But this year, I don't know why, I'm really congratulate funders that finally decided to fund journalists, research journalists, to actually go through and see through the investments of tech companies in Latin American governments. And they have done an amazing job, actually. And they are actually showing us the numbers, right? So this is, for example, the work that I showed was the Agencia Pública work, but there's also another media from Latin America looking at this tech corporation power. And I think it's something that we need to look very closely, not only because the lobby kind of meetings that they're having, but also this revolving door, right? So in Chile, I told you we have this revolving door with the minister that led the national data center plan, but also in Brazil, you can see the revolving door, no? From people who used to work in tech companies that now are working in governments, and then after a time they will go again to corporations and then again to governments. It's a playbook that we're seeing, no? But in a way, we are naturalized that kind of behavior, right? And I think it's time now to call out that and understand that when you work in the government, you need to actually, your first priority should be the communities, not the corporation. You have to actually try to, of course, bring investments and, improve economies, but you have to have the obligations with communities. And this is something that somehow in the last 30 years, in the crisis of democracies around the world, we have lost that. And we need to come back to that and rescue it because it's the main, step for a democracy is actually to people understand that they have a right in their own governments, right? And it's something that we need to do. So I really believe that this year will be a turning point in terms of understanding lobbying of the big tech companies. And I think that from this to the next years, what we need to do actually is to, in a way, ask for accountability, right? We have the numbers now, and now we can actually have the discourse for asking governments to stop this kind of revolving door, this lobbying, etc. No, we now have these numbers, and I think we have to do that in Latin America because now we have it. But also, I think it's something so important to do it globally. I don't know, Tamara, what you think about this. I think I don't know if globally is something that is important in terms of this. Um, this influence is something that is present in the public opinion, but I think we need to actually bring back that as an urgency matter for the public discourse, because otherwise this is naturalized and is one of the biggest problems that we're facing today.
Thanks, Paz. Tamara?
Yeah, definitely. One of the problems that we keep seeing is the use of NDAs on the parts of tech companies to shield themselves from any sort of transparency around what kinds of deals are actually happening. And so there's an interesting process in, talking to a lot of environmental justice groups on the ground. What's been happening is that their local officials are hearing directly from the data center lobbyists, and they are being promised all these things like tax subsidies, and jobs, right? And so there are all of these things that are in theory attached to the data center that are attached to being, connected to a big name tech company. And so people think, this will be an economic boon to communities, that there will be something that they're getting out of it. And I think it's been interesting to look at groups like Good Jobs First, which is a very tiny nonprofit here in the US, but they really went through and tried to analyze, at least in the US, state by state, how much states were actually losing because of their subsidies to big tech companies. And I think, you could certainly do a similar calculation anywhere, right? Where you're really looking at what are the actual economic benefits, if any, and how long are they? Are companies going to continue paying for the upkeep? Will they pay for transmission lines? Who is paying the cost? Is it the people in the area? And I think having the ability for people to slow down projects, because one of the biggest problems is that, communities are not even aware of which companies are trying to form the agreement with their local officials. And then by the time people know about it, it's often too late to stop it. It's already under construction. And so how do you ensure that people have a better sense of tracking where things are happening? And so a number of groups I am aware of are looking at permitting and siting, trying to keep track of where data center sites are likely to be planned, so that there's at least more time to slow down a project. Or, okay, so you can't stop every data center project, right? Maybe. And some places may want data centers too. I mean, that's the other very complicated part of this. I think, there are, what we have right now is this incredibly lopsided and clustered way where, we have just a handful of places that are really becoming data center hubs, which are going to have really negative impacts. But then for some places, it may be, a question of wanting a smaller data center where they actually have more community control over it. And so I think this question of, a form of data sovereignty, and access. So, is the data center, is the infrastructure and the burden that the community is paying when it comes to environmental justice concerns, are they even connected? Do they even have, are they benefiting in any way from this infrastructure? And I think, being able to really slow down a process and figure out what community benefits people would want. And so, how do you open up more space for negotiation? So that if, if a community does decide they do want a data center, how can they ensure that it is, the least harmful data center it can be? Because I think, that is the other problem is, we don't need these hyperscaler AI data centers probably, but we want the web. We want some data centers. We probably have enough already. So why don't we talk more about, data center maintenance and ensuring that, people actually have connectivity, rather than thinking about just endless expansion for the sake of expansion. So I think being able to have more community input and slowing down the construction process would be very helpful.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Yeah, like many states, they have committed internationally with treaties that they are the consultations, they are mandatory in Brazil, for example. And this needs to happen, in fact. So thank you once again for accepting to be here with us today, Paz and Tamara. It was really a fantastic discussion. I learned a lot as well. I'm sure that we have many questions left. I'm apologizing in advance for that, but we will try to address some of them also in the report that we are launching in the beginning of the year. So don't worry, like there is a question about resources, for example, for who wants to delve more into this agenda. We will put that also in the report, don't worry. And please join us for the next webinar that's taking place on October 29 on data work and political participation. So we will share the details soon. Please subscribe to the GTG Lab mailing list that Amy put here in the chat, the link for you. And have a nice day. Take care. Thank you so much for being here and participating with us. Bye-bye.